Sometimes the most important person in your life arrives because of a mistake nobody was supposed to make. At 11:47 on a rainy Tuesday night, Claire Bennett was sitting alone at her small kitchen table in Chicago, staring at an inbox that seemed determined to make her life more stressful. Her laptop glowed softly beneath the apartment light, while unpaid bills sat stacked beside a half-finished cup of tea. The rent was due in 6 days. Her mother's medical insurance paperwork still needed attention. And the freelance editing project she had spent 2 weeks completing had just been delayed again. Claire rubbed her eyes and sighed. Some days felt like she was running a marathon on a treadmill. A lot of effort, very little progress. She clicked through emails one by one, deleting advertisements and newsletters she never remembered subscribing to. Then a new message appeared. The subject line immediately caught her attention. "Are you still there?" Claire frowned. She did not recognize the sender. The email address looked professional but unfamiliar. Curious, she opened it. The message itself was surprisingly short. "Are you still there? I know it is late. I just needed to know if anyone was still listening." Claire stared at the screen. That was it. No signature. No explanation. No context. For a moment she assumed it was spam. Then she read it again. Something about the wording felt different. Human. Honest. Almost lonely. She checked the sender address once more. It appeared legitimate. Maybe someone had typed the wrong email. Maybe the message was intended for a friend, a coworker, or a family member. Common sense suggested she should ignore it. Yet the words lingered in her mind. I just needed to know if anyone was still listening. Claire leaned back in her chair. She remembered nights when she had felt exactly like that. Nights when the world seemed asleep while worry stayed wide awake. Without giving herself too much time to think, she clicked reply. "Hi, I think you may have the wrong person. But since you asked, yes, someone is still here. I hope whatever happened today gets a little easier tomorrow." She read the message twice before sending it. Then she laughed softly at herself. "Great job, Claire. Now you're answering random emails from strangers." She closed the laptop and prepared for bed. The entire incident was already beginning to feel silly. Somewhere else in the city, several floors above downtown Chicago, Ethan Parker sat alone inside a corner office overlooking thousands of lights stretching across the skyline. The headquarters of Parker Technologies occupied 42 floors of glass and steel. At that hour, almost everyone had gone home. Almost everyone except Ethan. The 36-year-old founder and chief executive officer stared at his own laptop, while financial reports covered half his desk. Investors wanted answers. Executives wanted decisions. Reporters wanted interviews. For years, he had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. According to magazines, he had everything a person could want. According to reality, he had not eaten dinner before 9 o'clock in nearly 4 months. Earlier that evening, exhausted after another endless meeting, Ethan had attempted to send a message to an old college friend. Instead, one missing letter in an email address had sent it somewhere else entirely. He never expected a response. Yet a notification suddenly appeared. Ethan frowned and opened it. His eyes moved across the screen. "Hi, I think you may have the wrong person. But since you asked, yes, someone is still here. I hope whatever happened today gets a little easier tomorrow." Ethan read the message twice. Then a third time. A strange smile appeared. For the first time all day, someone had said something that was not about profits, market shares, deadlines, or quarterly growth. A complete stranger had simply offered kindness. He looked at the clock. 11:58 p.m. He should have gone home an hour ago. Instead, he found himself typing another reply. "You are correct. Wrong person. My mistake. But thank you anyway." That was unexpectedly kind. Claire was already brushing her teeth when her phone vibrated. Curious, she checked the notification and laughed softly. The stranger had answered. Most people would have stopped there. Most people would have wished each other a good evening and disappeared forever. Neither Claire nor Ethan realized that a single mistyped email address had just changed the direction of 2 completely different lives. And neither of them had any idea who was sitting on the other side of the screen. The next morning, Claire woke up expecting to forget all about the strange email exchange. Life usually moved too fast to leave room for random encounters with strangers. By 7:30, she was already preparing breakfast for her mother before heading to the small publishing agency where she worked as a freelance editor. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and toasted bread while sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. Her mother sat at the table reviewing medical paperwork with the same determined expression she always wore whenever life became complicated. "You were up late," her mother said. Claire smiled. "Could not sleep. Too much thinking again." "Probably." Her mother laughed softly. "One day you are going to discover that worrying is not a productive hobby." Claire wished it were that simple. Between work deadlines, bills, and the constant pressure of trying to build a stable future, her thoughts rarely slowed down. Yet for some reason, as she prepared to leave, she found herself wondering whether the stranger had reached home safely after such a long night. The thought seemed ridiculous. She had never even learned his name. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan sat inside a board meeting that should have held his full attention. Financial projections covered a massive screen. Executives debated expansion strategies. Investors joined remotely from New York and San Francisco. Yet Ethan's mind kept drifting toward a simple email. "You may have the wrong person. But yes, someone is still here." He had received thousands of emails throughout his career. Most were requests, complaints, proposals, or demands. Very few felt human. Even fewer stayed in his thoughts the following morning. During a break between meetings, Ethan opened his inbox again. The conversation remained exactly where he left it. Common sense told him to move on. Instead, he typed another message. "Good morning, accidental email recipient. I hope your day is less stressful than mine is about to become." He stared at the message for a moment before sending it. Immediately afterward, he questioned his own decision. He was a 36-year-old chief executive officer running a billion-dollar company. Why was he emailing a stranger? Yet part of him already knew the answer. Because she had responded honestly when she had no reason to respond at all. Several hours later, Claire's phone buzzed while she was reviewing a manuscript at work. She glanced at the notification and nearly laughed out loud. The stranger had written again. Curious, she opened the email. "Good morning, accidental email recipient. I hope your day is less stressful than mine is about to become." Claire smiled. Something about the message felt unexpectedly genuine. Most people spent enormous amounts of energy pretending everything was fine. This stranger openly admitted he was stressed before lunch. She liked that. After a moment, she typed a reply. "Good morning, mysterious wrong email sender. Unfortunately, stress appears to be very popular today. However, I did discover that coffee improves almost everything. I recommend it." Ethan read her response 10 minutes later and laughed for the first time all day. The sound surprised even him. His assistant glanced up from across the office. "Good news?" she asked. Ethan closed the email window immediately. Something like that. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, it continued throughout the week. Not constantly, not obsessively, just enough to become a small part of each day. They never exchanged photographs. They never discussed personal details beyond first names. Claire introduced herself simply as Claire. Ethan introduced himself only as Ethan. No last names. No job titles. No social media accounts. Somehow that made everything easier. They talked about books, favorite childhood memories, terrible weather forecasts, the best comfort foods, the strangest things people worried about at 2 o'clock in the morning. Every conversation felt refreshingly normal. One Thursday night, Ethan found himself sitting alone in his penthouse apartment overlooking the city. The skyline sparkled beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, while expensive artwork decorated walls he rarely noticed anymore. On paper, his life looked extraordinary. Yet as he opened another email from Claire, he felt something he had not experienced in a very long time. Peace. Her message was simple. "Today was exhausting. But a little girl at the library told me she wants to become a writer one day." Somehow that made everything feel possible again. Ethan read the sentence twice. Then a third time. He realized something unusual. He was beginning to look forward to these emails. Not because they were exciting. Not because they were dramatic. But because they felt real. Across town, Claire felt exactly the same way. Neither of them realized it yet. But what began as a mistaken email was quietly becoming something much harder to ignore. And every night, when a new message appeared in their inbox, both found themselves smiling before they even opened it. Weeks passed, and somehow the accidental conversation became the most reliable part of both their lives. Every evening, usually sometime after 9 o'clock, a new message appeared. There was no agreement, no schedule, no expectation, yet it happened with remarkable consistency. Claire would finish helping her mother, settle into her favorite chair near the apartment window, and open her laptop. Somewhere across the city, Ethan would finally escape the endless cycle of meetings, reports, and decisions, then check his inbox before doing anything else. What surprised both of them was how easy it felt. Claire had friends, co-workers, and relatives she had known for years, yet some conversations still felt guarded. With Ethan, honesty arrived naturally. One Thursday night, she found herself typing something she had never shared with anyone outside her family. When I was 12, I wanted to be a novelist. I thought I would write stories that changed people's lives. Somewhere between growing up and paying bills, that dream got smaller. Ethan stared at the message for several moments. Then he replied, I wanted to build things that mattered. Somewhere between success and responsibility, I forgot why I started. Claire smiled at the screen. There it was again. That strange ability, he had to understand exactly what she meant. Over time, their emails grew longer. They discussed books, childhood memories, regrets, favorite places, and lessons learned from mistakes. Some nights they exchanged only a few sentences. Other nights they wrote pages. The most unusual part was that neither seemed interested in impressing the other. There were no carefully crafted performances, no exaggerated stories, no attempts to appear perfect. One rainy evening, Claire arrived home exhausted after a difficult day. A major client had rejected weeks of editing work. Her mother's insurance appeal had been delayed again. The weight of everything felt heavier than usual. She opened her laptop and found a new message waiting. Subject, small victories. The email contained only one question. What was the best part of your day? Claire laughed softly. Out of everything happening in her life, that was what he wanted to know. She thought for a moment before replying. A customer at the bookstore smiled when I recommended a novel. She came back later and said it reminded her of her late father. That felt nice. 10 minutes later, Ethan responded. Then that sounds like a successful day. Claire stared at the words longer than she intended. Nobody had called her day successful before. Not when bills remained unpaid. Not when projects failed. Yet somehow he had found value in a moment she almost ignored. Meanwhile, Ethan experienced something similar. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating series of meetings, he received an email from Claire asking a simple question. If you could spend one perfect day doing anything, what would it look like? Ethan almost answered with something impressive. Travel, adventure, luxury. Instead, he told the truth. A quiet morning, good coffee, no meetings, time to read, maybe a long walk. Claire's response arrived minutes later. That sounds surprisingly normal for someone who is always busy. Ethan smiled. She had no idea how accurate that observation was. More importantly, she had no idea who he really was. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself grateful for that fact. She liked him without knowing anything about his wealth, reputation, or influence. She responded to his thoughts, not his accomplishments. The realization became impossible to ignore. One Saturday evening, Ethan attended a charity gala filled with influential guests. Expensive suits, flashing cameras, endless conversations. On paper, it was an important event. Yet halfway through the evening, he caught himself checking his phone, wondering whether Claire had answered his latest email. The realization startled him. A room filled with powerful people held less interest than a message from a woman he had never met. Later that night, back at home, he opened her newest email. The subject line made him smile immediately. Subject, random question. The message was simple. Do you think it is possible to miss someone you have never actually met? Ethan read the sentence once. Then again. His heart beat slightly faster. Outside, city lights stretched across the darkness beyond his windows. Inside, a question lingered on the screen. For the first time since this strange journey began, Ethan realized the answer was yes. And based on how quickly he started typing his reply, he suspected Claire already knew the answer too. After that question, something subtle changed between them. Neither Claire nor Ethan mentioned it directly, yet both felt it. The emails became less like conversations between strangers and more like letters exchanged between two people slowly becoming part of each other's daily lives. Every morning began with the possibility of hearing from the other. Every evening ended with a message waiting somewhere in an inbox. Claire noticed it first. One Wednesday afternoon, while reviewing a manuscript at work, she caught herself smiling at a sentence because she knew Ethan would appreciate it. The realization made her pause. When had that started happening? When had a man she had never met become someone she instinctively wanted to share moments with? That evening, She arrived home carrying groceries and found her mother watching an old movie. "You seem happier lately," her mother observed. Claire set the grocery bags on the counter. "Do I? You smile at your laptop now." Claire nearly dropped a carton of milk. "That is a very strange observation." "It is also accurate." Her mother smiled knowingly before returning her attention to the television. Claire escaped to her room before additional questions arrived. Later that night, she opened her inbox and found a new message already waiting. Subject: long day. The email contained only a few lines. "I spent 9 hours in meetings today and somehow accomplished less than I hoped. Please tell me your day was more productive than mine." Claire laughed softly. She replied immediately. "I helped a customer find a novel she had been searching for since college. Therefore, I am declaring victory on behalf of both of us." Ethan received the message while sitting alone in his office long after sunset. He smiled despite the exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. Over the past month, Claire had become the one part of his day that felt uncomplicated. She did not ask about company valuations. She did not care about media coverage. She never treated him like an achievement. She treated him like a person. Unfortunately, maintaining that separation was becoming more difficult. During a leadership retreat the following week, Ethan found himself distracted repeatedly. While executives discussed expansion plans, he opened an email draft addressed to Claire, then closed it, then opened it again. He wanted to tell her more about himself. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to make the growing friendship feel honest. The problem was simple. Once she knew who he was, everything might change. Every relationship in his adult life seemed to change the moment people discovered his wealth and position. Some became overly impressed. Others became distant. A few became suspicious. Ethan had no interest in losing the one connection that felt genuine. Meanwhile, Claire remained unaware of the internal debate unfolding on the other side of the screen. One rainy Saturday, she spent the afternoon volunteering at a community literacy event. Children sat around folding tables reading stories, while local writers answered questions. Claire loved events like these. They reminded her why she fell in love with books in the first place. That evening, she described the experience in an email. Ethan read every word carefully. Halfway through the message, he stopped and reread one particular sentence. "Sometimes people do not need someone to solve their problems. They just need someone willing to listen." Ethan leaned back in his chair. Those words stayed with him long after he closed the laptop. He realized something uncomfortable. Claire had become far more important to him than he intended. He looked forward to her messages. He searched for them during difficult days. He reread old conversations when he could not sleep. The realization should have concerned him. Instead, it felt strangely right. Several nights later, while reviewing correspondence before bed, Ethan noticed something he had overlooked for weeks. One of Claire's emails mentioned a neighborhood bookstore she frequently visited. Another referenced a specific coffee shop near the river. A third mentioned attending a local author event scheduled the following month. Individually, the details meant nothing. Together, they formed the beginning of a map. Ethan stared at the screen. For the first time since the accidental email arrived, a thought entered his mind and refused to leave. What if he actually tried to find her? Not through investigators. Not through company resources. Simply through the small pieces of life she had shared naturally over time. The idea seemed unreasonable. Yet the more he considered it, the less unreasonable it felt. Somewhere in Chicago was a woman who wrote emails that could improve an entire day with a single paragraph. A woman who still believed kindness mattered. A woman who somehow made a billionaire's world feel smaller and warmer at the same time. Ethan closed his laptop and looked out across the city lights. For weeks, Claire had been nothing more than a name on a screen. Tonight, for the first time, he found himself wondering what would happen if that changed. The idea should have felt ridiculous. Instead, it stayed with Ethan for days. He told himself he was simply curious. Curious about the person behind the emails. Curious about the woman who somehow understood him better than people he had worked beside for years. Yet, deep down, he knew curiosity was no longer the entire truth. One Friday evening, after another week filled with meetings and deadlines, Ethan sat alone in his office reviewing old messages from Claire. He noticed details he had overlooked before. A reference to a bookstore near Lincoln Park. A mention of a coffee shop that displayed local artwork. A complaint about a construction project that delayed her morning commute. None of the details were private. None were enough to identify her immediately. But together they painted the outline of a life. A real life. One filled with responsibilities, family, work, and small moments of joy. Ethan closed the laptop and stared through the glass walls of his office. He had spent years making decisions based on data and strategy. This felt entirely different. For once, logic had very little influence. The following Saturday, he found himself walking through Lincoln Park without admitting to himself why. The neighborhood was filled with families, joggers, bookstores, cafes, and weekend crowds enjoying the mild weather. Ethan wore simple clothes and left his usual driver behind. He wanted to experience the city the way most people did. No attention, no expectations, just another face in the crowd. He stopped at a small bookstore and wandered through the shelves. For a brief moment, he wondered whether Claire had ever stood in the exact same aisle. The thought made him smile. Across town, Claire was completely unaware of the effect she was having on a man she had never met. Her Saturday was occupied with helping her mother organize medical paperwork and preparing for another freelance deadline. Yet throughout the day, she found herself checking her phone more often than usual. By evening, an email finally arrived. Subject: Unexpected Discovery. Claire opened it immediately. Today I learned that independent bookstores are more dangerous than they appear. I went inside one intending to browse for 10 minutes and left with 4 books. Claire laughed out loud. She typed a reply almost instantly. That is not danger. That is success. The exchange continued for nearly an hour. As always, the conversation felt effortless. Yet something was changing. The pauses between replies had become more noticeable. The anticipation stronger. The emotional investment deeper. Later that week, Ethan attended an executive dinner with several business leaders. The restaurant overlooked the Chicago River and served meals that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. Around the table, conversations revolved around acquisitions, investments, and market forecasts. Normally, Ethan could navigate such discussions effortlessly. Tonight, however, his attention drifted. When his phone vibrated with a new email notification, he glanced at it instinctively. A colleague sitting nearby noticed. Important message? Ethan looked down at the screen. Claire's name appeared in the subject preview. A surprisingly warm feeling settled in his chest. Yes, he answered honestly. Very important. Meanwhile, Claire was beginning to experience similar confusion. One evening, her best friend Rachel stopped by unexpectedly. Halfway through their conversation, Rachel narrowed her eyes suspiciously. Who is Ethan? Claire nearly spilled her coffee. What? You smiled at your laptop 3 times in 10 minutes. Claire laughed nervously. He is just someone I email. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Nobody smiles like that over someone who is just an email. The comment lingered long after Rachel left. Later that night, Claire found herself rereading old conversations. She realized Ethan had become part of her routine in ways she never intended. When something good happened, she wanted to tell him. When something frustrating happened, she wanted his opinion. Somehow a stranger had become the first person she thought about sharing things with. That realization was both comforting and frightening. The next morning, Ethan received an invitation to speak at a major creative industries conference scheduled for the following month. Normally, he would have accepted without hesitation. Then he noticed one detail. Among the featured participants would be several publishing professionals, editors, and independent authors from around Chicago. A possibility immediately formed in his mind. Small, uncertain, but impossible to ignore. What if Claire attended? That evening, he opened a new email. Subject: Random question. He hesitated before typing the message. Are you attending any interesting events next month? Conferences, book fairs, writing workshops, anything like that? Claire smiled when she read it. She did not know why the question felt significant. She simply answered honestly. Actually, yes. There is a publishing and creative industries conference I might attend. Work-related. Why? Ethan stared at the screen after reading her reply. For the first time since the accidental email arrived months earlier, the distance between them suddenly felt much smaller. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty began to grow. The woman who had changed his life with a simple reply might be closer than either of them realized. The conference arrived on a bright autumn morning that seemed determined to make everything feel significant. Claire stood in front of her apartment mirror longer than usual, adjusting the sleeve of a navy blazer she rarely wore. The event represented an opportunity for professional growth, networking, and new publishing connections. At least that was what she kept telling herself. The truth was more complicated. Ever since exchanging those messages with Ethan, she could not ignore a strange feeling that something important was approaching. She had no logical reason to believe he would be there. Chicago was a large city. Thousands of people attended conferences every year. Yet when she opened her inbox that morning, she found a short message waiting. Subject: good luck today. I hope the conference exceeds your expectations. Claire smiled. Somehow he remembered the date. Good luck with your mysterious schedule today, she replied. A few minutes later, Ethan read her message from a private conference room several floors above the main exhibition hall. He smiled despite the nerves he rarely experienced anymore. For months, Claire had existed as a voice, a personality, and a collection of thoughts appearing on a screen. Today, that might finally change. The possibility felt both exciting and terrifying. He had built companies, negotiated major deals, and spoken before thousands of people without hesitation. Yet the thought of meeting one woman made him unexpectedly anxious. Downstairs, the conference center buzzed with energy. Publishing professionals, authors, editors, marketers, and creative entrepreneurs filled the halls. Claire spent the morning attending workshops and discussion panels. Every so often she caught herself wondering whether Ethan was somewhere in the city doing whatever mysterious work he always seemed reluctant to discuss. Around noon, attendees began gathering inside the largest auditorium for the keynote presentation. Claire followed the crowd and found a seat near the middle. The room gradually filled. Large screens illuminated the stage while event staff prepared for the next session. Claire opened the conference program and began reviewing the afternoon schedule. Then she froze. Her eyes locked onto a photograph printed across an entire page. The world seemed to narrow instantly. The man smiling from the program looked painfully familiar. Dark hair, calm expression, the same face she had seen once in a small professional profile attached to an article she accidentally found weeks ago while researching technology trends. Below the photograph appeared a name: Ethan Parker, founder and chief executive officer. Parker Technologies. Claire stared at the page. Her heartbeat accelerated. No, that could not be possible. She read the description again. Founder, chief executive officer, billion-dollar technology company, national innovation awards, philanthropic initiatives, industry leadership. The words blurred together. Her mind immediately raced through months of conversations. The vague answers about work, the unusual schedule, the intelligence, the way he avoided specific details whenever careers became the topic. Suddenly everything made sense. Before she could process the revelation, the lights dimmed. Applause erupted throughout the auditorium. Claire looked up. A presenter stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone. Then came the introduction. Please join me in welcoming entrepreneur and innovator Ethan Parker. The room exploded into applause. Hundreds of attendees stood. Claire remained frozen in her seat. Ethan walked onto the stage. For one brief second, his eyes scanned the audience. Then he saw her. Even from a distance, Claire noticed the exact moment recognition appeared on his face. Surprise, concern, understanding. He knew. He knew she had discovered everything. The applause continued while Ethan approached the podium. Yet for Claire, the room had become strangely quiet. The man she had trusted. The man who knew her dreams, fears, frustrations, and hopes. The man whose emails she looked forward to every day. He was not simply a busy professional. He was one of the most successful business leaders in the country. Ethan began speaking, but Claire struggled to focus on the words. Instead, she found herself wrestling with a flood of emotions. Shock, confusion, disappointment, curiosity. None of them had anything to do with money. What hurt was realizing how much he had hidden. Every honest conversation suddenly felt incomplete. Every unanswered question seemed significant. When the keynote ended, the audience rose again in applause. Claire remained seated for a moment, trying to steady her thoughts. Then she stood and headed toward the exit. She needed air. She needed distance. Most of all, she needed answers. Behind her, Ethan stepped away from the stage and watched the crowd disperse. Among hundreds of people, he searched for only one face. And when he saw Claire disappearing through the auditorium doors, he realized the hardest conversation of his life was about to begin. Claire stepped outside the conference center into the cool afternoon air and kept walking until the noise of the crowd faded behind her. The city moved around her as usual. Cars passed. Pedestrians hurried along sidewalks. Somewhere nearby, a street musician played a familiar melody. Yet everything felt strangely distant. For months, Ethan had been a voice in her inbox. A person who understood her fears, encouraged her dreams, and somehow made difficult days easier. Now she knew he had hidden something enormous. Not just a successful career, an entire world. She reached a small plaza overlooking the river and stopped beside a railing. The water reflected sunlight in scattered flashes of silver. Claire took a slow breath, hoping clarity would arrive with it. Instead, questions multiplied. Had their friendship been real? Had he been studying her the entire time? Had every conversation been shaped by things he chose not to reveal? Footsteps approached from behind. Claire did not need to turn around to know who it was. "I was hoping you would give me a chance to explain," Ethan said quietly. She closed her eyes for a moment before facing him. Gone was the confident speaker from the stage. Standing before her was the same man from the emails. Yet now both versions existed at once. "Explain what?" Claire asked. "That you forgot to mention you own one of the largest technology companies in the country?" Ethan accepted the frustration in her voice without arguing. "I know how it looks." Claire laughed softly. "That is the problem. I do not know how it looks. I thought I knew who you were." For a moment neither spoke. The river moved steadily behind them. Ethan glanced toward the water before meeting her eyes again. "Everything I told you was true." "Not everything." The words landed harder than she intended. Ethan nodded. "You are right." Claire folded her arms. "Why?" Ethan took a slow breath. "Because the moment people learn who I am, something changes." Claire remained silent. "Some become impressed. Some become uncomfortable. Some start treating me differently. Very few keep acting like themselves." He smiled sadly. "You never did." Claire looked away. Part of her understood exactly what he meant. Another part still felt hurt. "You should have trusted me enough to tell me." Ethan nodded immediately. "I should have." The honesty caught her off guard. She expected excuses. Instead, he simply accepted responsibility. "Every time I planned to tell you, it became harder," he continued. "The more our conversations mattered, the more I worried about losing them." Claire stared at him. The sincerity in his voice made anger difficult to hold on to. "You really thought I would stop talking to you because you were successful?" Ethan laughed softly. "You would be surprised." The answer carried more truth than humor. For the first time, Claire wondered how lonely success might actually be. Not financially, emotionally. How many people spoke to Ethan because of who he was rather than what he represented? The thought softened something inside her. "You know what the worst part is?" she asked quietly. Ethan shook his head. "I missed you." The admission surprised both of them. Claire looked down at the sidewalk. "The last few weeks felt strange without our emails." Ethan smiled faintly. "I missed you too." Silence settled between them again, but this time it felt different. Less like distance, more like understanding. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Claire recognized it instantly. A printed copy of the very first email she had sent months ago. Her eyes widened. "You kept that?" Ethan nodded. "I keep all of them." Claire stared at the page. The simple reply she almost never sent. The message that started everything. "That is either incredibly sweet or slightly ridiculous," she said. "Possibly both." She laughed despite herself. The sound seemed to ease the tension that had followed them since the conference. Ethan looked relieved. "Claire, there is something else you should know." She waited. "I never searched for your social media. I never hired anyone to investigate you. Everything I learned came from the things you chose to share." Claire studied him carefully. Somehow that mattered. Not because he lacked the resources to find information. Because he respected the boundary. Ethan stepped closer, though still leaving plenty of space between them. "I wanted to know the real you. Not a profile. Not a public version. You." Claire felt her heart beat a little faster. The city seemed quieter somehow. Or maybe she simply stopped paying attention to it. "And what if the real me is not very impressive?" she asked. Ethan smiled immediately. "That is my favorite part." For the first time since discovering the truth, Claire saw beyond the billionaire, the headlines, and the stage. She saw the man who stayed awake answering emails. The man who remembered small details. The man who kept a printed copy of a message because it mattered to him. And standing beside the river beneath the fading afternoon sun, she realized the most important thing had never changed. Ethan was still the person who had written back after a wrong email. And she was still the woman who answered it. The weeks after the conference felt different in the best possible way. For the first time, there were no hidden questions standing between them. Claire no longer wondered what Ethan did for a living, and Ethan no longer felt the need to carefully navigate around parts of his life. Their emails continued, but now they were joined by phone calls, coffee meetings, and long conversations that stretched far beyond midnight. What surprised Claire most was how little his wealth mattered once the mystery disappeared. Ethan was still the same man who remembered her mother's doctor appointments. Still the same man who asked about books she was reading. Still the same man who could turn an ordinary Tuesday into something memorable with a thoughtful message. One evening, they sat together in a quiet cafe overlooking the river. Outside, city lights shimmered across the water. Inside, the familiar comfort between them felt effortless. Claire stirred her coffee and smiled. "You know, I imagined you differently before I knew who you were." Ethan laughed. "Good differently or bad differently?" "Honestly, always. I thought you were probably an accountant." Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. "An accountant?" Claire nodded seriously. "You seemed responsible. That might be the least exciting description anyone has ever given me. You should be grateful. I almost guessed insurance." Ethan laughed so hard that several people glanced toward their table. Moments like these had become common. Simple, easy, real. Yet beneath the laughter, something deeper continued growing. A few days later, Ethan invited Claire to visit a community education center his foundation had recently completed. The building sat in a neighborhood that had struggled with funding for years. When they arrived, children filled reading rooms, computer labs, and creative spaces. Volunteers helped students with homework while parents attended workshops nearby. Claire watched everything quietly. "This is incredible," she said. Ethan smiled. "I hoped you would like it." She walked through the center slowly, reading signs and observing classrooms. Then she stopped in front of a wall covered with handwritten notes from students. One message caught her attention immediately. "Thank you for creating a place where people listen." Claire stared at the sentence. It reminded her of the very first email. The message that started everything. Ethan noticed her expression. "Funny, isn't it?" he said softly. "What is?" Claire asked. "One wrong email changed my entire life." She looked at him. The sincerity in his voice left no room for doubt. Ethan continued. "People assume success comes from big decisions, major opportunities, important moments." He smiled faintly. "But the most important thing that happened to me this year started because somebody answered a message that was not meant for them." Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. For months, she had wondered why Ethan cared so much. Why he searched. Why he stayed. Why he refused to let a simple mistake disappear. Standing there, she finally understood. It was never about the email itself. It was about what happened afterward. The honesty, the trust, the connection. Later that evening, they walked through a nearby park while autumn leaves drifted across the path. The city seemed quieter than usual. Ethan stopped near a bench overlooking the skyline. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. Claire immediately recognized it. Her very first reply, the one he had printed months ago. He handed it to her. She smiled as she read the familiar words. "I think you may have the wrong person. But since you asked, yes, someone is still here." When she looked up again, Ethan's expression had changed. There was something vulnerable in his eyes she had never seen before. "Do you know why I kept that?" he asked quietly. Claire shook her head. Ethan glanced toward the city lights before answering. "Because on a night when everything felt overwhelming, a complete stranger reminded me I was not alone." The words settled gently between them. Claire felt tears gathering despite her efforts to stop them. Ethan smiled softly. "I spent months trying to understand why your emails mattered so much." He paused. "Eventually I realized it was because they were never really about emails." Claire's heart beat faster. "What were they about?" Ethan looked directly at her. "You." For a moment, the entire world seemed to disappear. The city, the traffic, the distant sounds around them. None of it mattered. Because after months of conversations, misunderstandings, searching, and revelations, the truth was finally simple. Ethan had not been looking for an email. He had been looking for the woman who answered it. 1 year later, Claire stood inside a bright community writing center filled with laughter, conversation, and the sound of pages turning. Sunlight poured through tall windows while young writers sat around tables covered with notebooks and story drafts. What had started as a small dream had grown into something real. With support from local educators, volunteers, and a generous grant from a certain technology foundation, the center now helped hundreds of teenagers discover their voices through writing. Claire walked between tables offering encouragement and feedback, smiling every time she saw a student gain confidence. Moments like these reminded her why she had fallen in love with stories in the first place. Across the room hung a framed quote that visitors often stopped to read. Sometimes one conversation can change an entire life. Very few people knew how literally that statement applied to her. Life had changed in countless ways over the previous year. Her mother's health had improved. The financial pressure that once seemed endless had finally eased. Most importantly, the relationship that began with a mistaken email had continued to grow stronger with every passing day. Ethan remained exactly who he had always been beneath the headlines and accomplishments. He still sent messages asking about her day. He still remembered tiny details that most people forgot. He still made time for the people he cared about no matter how demanding his schedule became. Their worlds had blended naturally. Claire became comfortable attending foundation events and community projects. Ethan became a familiar guest at family dinners where Claire's mother continued treating him like a son. What surprised both of them was how normal happiness eventually felt. Not dramatic, not complicated, simply steady and real. That afternoon, the center hosted its first anniversary celebration. Students presented stories they had written throughout the year. Families filled the building. Volunteers moved between rooms carrying refreshments and decorations. Claire spent most of the afternoon helping coordinate activities. By early evening, the event was finally winding down. One by one, families headed home. Chairs were folded. Supplies were packed away. The building gradually grew quieter. Claire stood alone in the main room gathering papers when she noticed an envelope resting on her desk. Her name appeared on the front in familiar handwriting. Immediately, she smiled. Ethan. He was supposed to arrive later after finishing a meeting across town. Curious, she opened the envelope. Inside was a printed copy of an old email. The very first one. The message she almost ignored. The message that changed everything. Her eyes moved to the subject line. Are you still there? Claire laughed softly as memories flooded back. Then she noticed a handwritten note beneath the printed message. Look outside. Still smiling, she carried the paper toward the front entrance. Evening sunlight painted the city in shades of gold and amber. Across the street stood Ethan. He wore a navy suit, but looked far more nervous than any billionaire chief executive officer should. Claire immediately knew something unusual was happening. As she crossed the sidewalk toward him, Ethan held up another piece of paper. Do you remember this? He asked. Claire nodded. How could I forget? Ethan smiled. Good. Because it started the best chapter of my life. Claire felt her heart beating faster. Around them, the city continued moving normally. People walked past. Cars rolled through intersections. Yet the moment felt strangely suspended in time. Ethan took a slow breath. A year ago, I sent a message to the wrong person. Claire laughed. You definitely did. And somehow the wrong person turned out to be exactly the right person. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded one final page. Across the top appeared the same familiar subject line. Are you still there? Below it was a new message. Claire, every good thing in my life began because you answered when you had no reason to. You listened when you did not know me. You believed in me before you understood who I was. You became my favorite conversation, my favorite person, and my favorite part of every day. The tears slipped freely down Claire's cheeks now. Ethan looked at her with the same sincerity she had seen in every email from the beginning. Then he lowered himself onto one knee. The city seemed to disappear completely. Claire Bennett, he said softly. Are you still there? She laughed through tears. Yes. Ethan smiled. Good. Because I never want a day without you. He opened a small ring box. Will you marry me? Claire did not hesitate for even a second. Yes. The answer came instantly. Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger as applause suddenly erupted behind them. Claire turned and discovered students, volunteers, family members, and friends standing outside the center, smiling and cheering. Her mother wiped away tears. Ethan laughed. I may have arranged a few things. Claire shook her head, still laughing. Then she wrapped her arms around him as the crowd celebrated around them. Above the entrance to the writing center, the evening sun illuminated a simple sign. Stories change lives. and for two people brought together by a mistaken email that had never been more true.